The next surface attribute we are going to be covering is called the specular attribute. The specular component to a surface are the highlights that you see on a surface, so it's how shiny a surface is. The highlights on an object tell you how finely polished it is. An object without any specular highlights is either coarse or made out of cloth or specifically treated to not have highlights. Specular highlights are a different part of the surface than the reflections of objects. That would be reflectivity. The specular attribute simulates the appearance of a light source's hot spot reflecting on a surface. This is commonly known as the highlight. The smaller the highlights are, the more finely focused they are, which means the more polished the surface is. So for instance, billiard balls are very, very smooth, with very small bright highlights. So is polished rock. This means they are polished very, very finely. They have a very smooth surface, and as a result they pick up small specular highlights. The actual color of a surface is irrelevant to the highlights that appear on the surface. For instance, if you take something like granite, black and white granite, it's nothing but a checkerboard of white granules and black granules all smashed together. So whereas you might think something that's just black and white like that would have its own specific kinds of specular highlights, the actual underlying surface color does not make any difference. You can have granite that has no specular highlights to it because the surface is rough and broken. Or you could start polishing the rock to the point that it becomes very, very smooth. And then you'll end up with those nice specular highlights shining right across the surface, totally disregarding the fact that the underlying color is black in one spot and white in the next. Now, the appearance of highlights on an object is dependent on a number of things. Just by cranking up the specular level over here doesn't mean that you'll automatically get highlights on an object. They're dependent on the intensity and color of the lights in the scene and also on the position of those lights. Specular highlights are generated based upon mirror reflection angles. So if your object and your light source don't align such that you would see a reflection of the light source in the object if it were a mirror, then you're not going to see the highlights either. You've got to have the proper reflection angles to get them to show up. So we'll be covering reflection angles and things like that in the CD on lighting. But in the meantime, a great little tip for getting your specular highlights to show up is to make sure that whatever surface you are trying to get highlights to appear on is either curvy or has a number of facets, like edge bevels, to it. If you do that, the chances of actually seeing the specular highlights along those edges is going to be much, much higher than it would if you just have two surfaces connecting at a sharp edge. So, more about that down the road. In the meantime, then, let's go on to specular brightness and specular color. The brightness of the specular highlight is set using the value slider. By setting it at the top, the highlight is very bright. By setting it down lower and lower, you can see how the specular highlight starts to dim out. Now, Electric Image's default for specular highlights is all the way at the top, 100%. And unfortunately, this is too bright. If you leave your specular highlights at 100%, you'll almost always overexpose the highlights. If you overexpose anything, you'll never be able to do a color correction or a levels correction to it to get the shading back out of it. If it's overexposed, there's not going to be anything but white pixels there. There's not going to be any shading or color variation within the highlight itself, and that's usually very important to keep. So always reduce the value level of your specular highlights down to 50% just to get in the ballpark. Once you've got the rest of the scene set up and you need to boost the brightness here or lower it there, then you can work with it. Then you'll have some room to work with, either higher or lower. But in the meantime, if you just drop everything down to 50%, you're going to be more in the ballpark than you would if you left everything at 100%. The next interesting thing is, a highlight's color is always more the color of the light rather than the color of the object. Say your object is blue. If you have a white light hitting a blue object, the specular highlight is going to appear white. If you have a red light shining on a blue object, the red and blue will mix a little and the specular highlight is going to appear magenta. So for the most part, if you have a decently bright specular highlight, the highlight is going to appear in the color of the light that's creating it. The color of a highlight can be altered by using the hue and saturation sliders. So even though it's appearing in the color of the light, you can tint the highlight to make it appear in green, yellow, blue, maroon, or any other color you'd like. You can get some pretty strange effects by doing this. The brightness and the color of the specular highlights are controlled using these sliders. The size of the specular highlight is controlled using the specular highlight index. As we said before, small bright highlights indicate highly polished surfaces. As the highlight gets larger and larger, the polish of the surface gets more and more rough. You make the highlight larger by lowering the value of the specular index. So this picture shows the specular defaults. The index is at 200 and the value slider is all the way up. As you can see, this is the perfect settings for plastic and other polished things. The next picture is the same setup with the index set down to 50 instead of 200. By the way, there's very little difference between a setting of 200 and a setting of 100. They're both very thin, very small. 50 expands it significantly, but everything still has a fairly polished look to it. My personal defaults are an index setting of 20. You can see how a setting of 20 spreads the highlight out quite a bit, and the next picture shows you the rest of my defaults where I've set the value slider down to half. Here we have a nice sheen on some objects. This is an example of where the highlight looks like it's part of the object rather than the thing that's trying to capture all of your attention. As the highlights get even larger than a setting of 20, for instance here we have a setting of 5, you can see how the objects take on a satiny look. All the objects now look as though their surfaces have been brushed, so it spreads the highlight out rather than keeping it tightly focused. The next picture here shows a very large highlight. You can see the index is set to 2, and the value of the highlight has been set way down to 25. Usually as you spread out the index, you also want to dim down the value. The two need to work together. If you have too bright of a value that's spread out very large, it tends to overkill the effect, overexposes the object, and washes out any texture, color, or shading that might be there. So in this picture then, you can see how everything has just a little sheen to it. It really doesn't look like it's a highlight, it just looks like a nice satiny sheen. If you want to take the highlight away totally, like we did in this last picture, you can set the value down to 0. Once you set the value down to 0, you don't need to worry about the index level at all. And by the way, it's better to use the value setting to eliminate the highlight than to set the index up to some astronomical figure like 4,000. So by setting the value down to 0, you can remove the highlight, making the objects very flat looking, like you've got something that's made out of cloth or felt or something that absorbs all of the light and doesn't shoot back any highlights at all. You can see from the pictures we've just gone through, by altering the specular highlights we can get this very, very wide range of surface appearances. There's a lot of power here. It's something that you should definitely devote some time to mastering.